Welcome to the webinar, Sustainable Procurement, Successfully Bringing Local and Indigenous Communities into Your Supply Chain, sponsored by CIM Magazine and Avetta. I am your organizer, Michelle Beacom, Managing Editor of CIM Magazine, and my co-organizer is Ryan Bergen, Editor-in-Chief of CIM Magazine. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. But before we get started, I just need to do a little bit of housekeeping. If you joined by computer audio, please make sure you've selected the computer button. If you joined by phone, make sure that you've selected the phone button. And if you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box that's underneath the question mark in your GoToWebinar control panel. And please feel free to type them into the question box as the questions arise. We will have some poll questions right at the beginning, and then we will kick it off. But first, I'm going to turn it over to Ryan to introduce today's presenter. Thank you.
Ryan, you may be on mute.
Yes, you are on mute.
Terribly sorry. Okay, sorry. Today's presenter is Katie Martin, Director of Sustainability and Innovation at Avetta, where she architects solutions to address ESG leaders' organizational goals across their supply chains, from initial program development to optimization and reporting, leveraging Avetta's best-in-class technology platform to deliver transformative results for partners. Now, please, over to you, Katie.
Excellent. Thank you, Ryan, and hello, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm really excited to speak to this topic. It's something near and dear to my heart as we work on in partnership with many of our clients at Avetta on a daily basis across our sustainability offering. But before we jump in, I thought it would be great to get started with a few poll questions just to get a sense of who is attending today and hopefully allow me to kind of contextualize what I'm sharing along the way. So our first question is going to be around where your level of kind of interest and responsibility lies within the organization, and also around your level of ESG maturity. So when you think about your organization and its approach to just ESG in general, and of course you can make it specific to our topic today around the S of ESG, so those social considerations like community impact and Indigenous inclusion and well-being, where would you roughly kind of rank yourselves as an organization? And of course, we're not, taking names or anything here, so please feel free to be as transparent as possible. And it does look like we've gotten some really good responses thus far, and they're still kind of coming in. So feel free to continue that for a bit longer. We want to make sure we get everyone's voices heard here. But it looks like a pretty even split across our four maturity trajectories here, which is not uncommon, but I'll try to kind of oscillate and adjust the depth and breadth of the topics we cover today accordingly. Please bear with me because for some of you this may seem a bit too advanced, and for some of you this may seem things that are kind of table stakes or already ingested in the organization, but we'll try to meet everyone's needs here. But it looks like almost evenly split, with about 30% having that more advanced maturity level. So that's really exciting to see, and hopefully get some good conversation and questions in. And then for our second poll, we'll jump into here just to get a sense of your level of participation and responsibility in the organization's kind of ESG flow. And again, this could be kind of your broader sustainability, or you could kind of taper it to the S level we're speaking to today around Indigenous communities and procurement and things of that nature. But are you kind of the sole lead responsible executor for that program and its reporting? Are you kind of someone who plays a role in it and contributes to the annual compliance reporting or whatever requirements are for your organization? Or are you kind of just tertiarily involved, but you see from a regulatory perspective, you're likely to be pulled more and more into this cycle? Let's see, and this, we're a little less split evenly. It looks like more than half of our attendees thus far are kind of more so in the not involved just yet, or kind of minimally involved and asked to provide data. So it's really great to have you here, as we know this is a rapidly expanding ecosystem, and that's likely to pull different facets of your organization and roles and responsibilities in more and more as compliance reporting and risk management grows. And it looks like we have then about 30% either they're collaborating with the ESG leads or they are the leader themselves. So really helpful to see, appreciate everyone participating. And again, I'll try to kind of speak to the level of maturity you see in your organizations, and then also, your level of role and responsibility as well. Give me 1 second here. We're just going to tee up screen share, and I think I might keep it a little on the dirty side here when we're viewing kind of the slide pieces, but let's see if we can get this moving from a technological perspective. All right, so as I was putting this together, of course, we're going to speak to and focus on sustainable procurement specifically, but as we all know, kind of the mining value chain is pretty interconnected and dependent. So while we will speak about like the procurement process and incorporating Indigenous communities into that aspect of your work, we recognize there's upstream and downstream activities as well that are connected and have opportunities to raise Indigenous voices and concerns into the process and ensure that you're not only meeting compliance thresholds, but also doing kind of proactive risk management in this space. As we all know, this is becoming a bit more of a scrutinized issue, a lot more stakeholder concerns internally and externally, and a lot more press coverage as well. So we'll speak through all of those things that are probably oscillating around you and your need to balance kind of business requirements with sustainability and whatever commitments your organization has made as well. Just really quickly about me from a contextual perspective. So I serve as the Director of Sustainability and Innovation at Avetta. Avetta is a supply chain risk management company. We started off traditionally in the health and safety side, and as the nature of risk has expanded to include facets like sustainability, we've started building those tool sets into our existing platform. So I help manage that aspect of our work, including about 130,000 suppliers that we work with. And I'm getting a note that people can't see my slides. Just for our CIM folks from a technical perspective, was I screen sharing previously, or are people not able to see the slides? Michelle or Ryan here.
We were able to see your slides earlier.
Okay, great. Just want to make sure I got a little quick note on that. Forgive me. So I'll jump back in here, everyone. The joys of digital life post-COVID here. So we'll get going again. Perfect. So as I was mentioning, so we work with about 130,000 companies globally across a myriad of risk management concerns. I help connect our folks, and part of what I'll be bringing into the conversation today is around this kind of hyper aggressive movement in the regulatory space globally around sustainability issues, including environmental and social aspects, and specifically those, of course, drilling down into the mining components. So what we'll kind of cover is the breadth and depth of that, and I'll try to bring in exemplars as well from our existing client groups that have gone through this process, including strategies that they've utilized to bring more Indigenous providers and suppliers into their supply chain, and also to work with all supplier groups, including Indigenous groups, around moving up that kind of sustainability compliance.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Katie, but again, your slides came on for a second and then they disappeared. I don't know if you're talking to your slides or...
I am, and I'm sharing them on my side. I guess folks aren't seeing them. Let me do... Again.
We see them only for a split second. Like now we can see it.
Okay. I think I'm going to just have to leave it in this format and not do full screen. So apologies, folks, for being able to see a little more of the PowerPoint piece. Of course, we'll be sharing these afterwards as well to dig into, but I think I'll leave it in this kind of format now, just to ensure that everyone can continue to see them.
Perfect. Thank you.
Great. So contextually, that's where I'm coming from. I've spent a lot of time in this space, mostly in the kind of product development component. So building kind of the platforms that a lot of you likely use to manage your procurement processes and sustainment and ESG pieces. So I was really excited to join Avetta and see the kind of convergence of this piece, specifically in driving kind of procurement data that helps organizations make an environmentally and socially sound decisions that align with their business needs and help their suppliers grow over time. So as we talk through this, I'll incorporate some of the aspects because, as I mentioned, it is kind of an interwoven tapestry within your organization, especially as we think about integrating suppliers into our procurement process, ensuring that they're meeting our standards and deliverables, and also helping drive continued growth and compliance improvement in those suppliers, whether specifically around ESG or other business concerns and training opportunities. So what we'll jump through today is really setting the stage on why it's important to incorporate Indigenous communities into our supply chains and value chains and the distinction between that. I would think and hope for folks attending this today, there's a general consensus and understanding of this, but I think it's always good to speak to this directly, make sure we're all on the same page. And I think it's also important to recognize that while you may see these components and the necessity of them, even beyond a compliance standpoint, we likely have work to do within our own organizations as well to help folks understand why this is of import. And common concerns and pushback anytime that we're speaking to specific demographic groups, whether they're women-owned businesses or veteran-owned businesses or Indigenous communities, is a presumption of merit within our existing process and how this new project may interrupt that, and making sure that we actually alleviate those concerns and address them directly. So talking about the complexities of that within the greater kind of marketplace that we're in around the drivers and demands for the materials that we are mining, balancing that with sustainability, thinking about opportunities then to kind of maximize Indigenous participation at these various stages of the mining process. Obviously, we'll double click more into the procurement aspect, but of course, as I mentioned, a lot of these are interconnected. And I think given the various roles that we have attending to, there's a lot of folks that understand, you may own a piece of the project pie, but there's a lot of stakeholders around that pie that you have to kind of integrate with and ensure alignment with. I learn best by examples, and I feel that a lot of folks do too. So beyond speaking to the specific steps you could take, we'll look at companies that have actually executed some of these programs successfully and the strategies that they utilized. I'll say this is not to put a gold star on any particular group that we discussed today, whether that's looking at retroactively folks that have had challenges in this space or proactively looking at those that have executed good programs, but just to kind of give you a sense of the risks and opportunities that are coming through in real world examples of Canadian companies in this space. And then last but not least, we'll speak specifically to the governance components and how you can actually bring all of this to life. I think there is a penchant to want to jump in and do, and I love that because that's where I come from as well. But without understanding kind of setting the stage in the historical context and also understanding the governance and components needed to keep this process moving and hold us accountable to our commitments, it all kind of falls apart in the middle. So we'll make sure we kind of close that loop for everybody. Great. So let's kind of discuss the environment that we're in right now and some of the drivers that are pushing increased focus and reporting around Indigenous communities and their participation in our supply chains, especially when it comes to mining. And some of this may be a distinct no-brainer, just given the complexities of mining, but also the fact that it does require, situation on land mass and a certain kind of reconfiguration of that mass and the impacts that it has. But before we get into that, we alluded to this a little bit, but some of the things as well internally as an organization that you want to make sure that these conversations have been had with the relative stakeholders. And typically a lot of this gets more of its oomph in terms of business integration when it comes top down. So you want to think about your board, your C-suite, your senior stakeholders, but really making sure people understand why Indigenous voices matter in your business process. And yes, there is a compliance aspect, and yes, there is a risk management aspect, But rather than there being kind of like lagging indicators in that space, like what are the leading indicators? What values can these drive for your organization? How can taking in the collective wisdom and principles of the Indigenous communities around your sites help you avoid environmental risks or regulatory hurdles and help you prepare your business for success? And of course, integrate within that community successfully. And so this is kind of like an esoteric piece, but I think it's one that we, again, skip over. And this is where you get pushback and concerns about quotas, or that we're bringing in suppliers that may not, meet our standards and things of that nature, when that's not what's happening. But we're rather trying to address kind of challenges with our existing system that are biased against certain communities, and how can we kind of course correct that, and also along the way contribute positively to the communities that we're operating in. So again, a lot of this happens with kind of internal management and education, thinking about the historical context of the locations you're in, not only in Canada proper, but wherever obviously your sites are occupied in South America or various other aspects of the world, and the communities impacted by that, and ensure that you have the proper governance and incentives aligned. So a lot of governance is probably force formed from the rise of the regulations that we'll kind of walk through in a second around the responsibilities mining companies have for interacting with Indigenous communities. But making sure that where able, you're pushing past compliance and thinking about how you are ensuring accountability for those commitments, that the correct level of seniority and representatives are on those governance committees to ensure the right level of oversight and leverage, and really making sure that you're pushing your company as far as possible in this space to avoid challenges, and of course to proactively drive value through the integration of Indigenous communities. So what's kind of pushing a lot of the regulatory development around this space, and a heightened look at procurement processes and involvement as well. And this is something that I'm sure keeps a lot of folks up at night, whether it's specific to those in the mining verticals or otherwise, which is there are a lot of market forces pushing us as the world is changing quite rapidly, from a people perspective and an environmental perspective, and then from that almost conflicting stakeholder requirements around those pieces as well. So part of that being, as we recognize specifically that there's a certain core minerals and materials that are required for our existing economy and for the shift that we're anticipating as we push to reduce carbon, move into a more electrified place, significant requirements on lithium and copper and pieces like that. And that is driving a great demand for these materials. At the same time, we recognize there is a significant market share already captured by specific countries. And when we think about like the sovereignty and market stability that we'd like to see in the international market, a lot of countries are trying to address that with mining commitments and goals around these components. And on the back of that, as we think about the land that is utilized in these pieces, a lot of it is in Indigenous communities. And I think there is roughly about 7 to 8% of the world's population identifying as Indigenous under the UN standards, which is pretty much self-ascribed. Each country kind of has its own nomenclature as well as Canada does. But almost 30% of the land that contains these minerals and components that we need to utilize is Indigenous land. And so while from a population perspective, a little smaller, a significant amount of holdings from a geographic perspective. And so as we think about these competing forces and needing to likely increase mining significantly, how do we balance that with the sustainability needs, both the environmental ones, which are already complex and significant, as well as these social components that we're trying to achieve with Indigenous participation, collaboration, and benefit being a big piece of that. So, sorry, this is an ugly slide, but I always like to include kind of just an index of components and regulatory pieces, frameworks that you should have in mind. I'm sure a lot of these are easily recognizable and maybe part of your daily work for a lot of you on the phone. But recognizing as well that there are a significant amount of compliance level tasks and mandates already in this space that help provide structure and kind of a baseline expectation for what a structured program looks like and what reporting requirements look like. But a lot of these also being good guidance in terms of specific actions and strategies that can be utilized when you're building both relationships with Indigenous communities, but also the specific kind of documentation and governance that creates the connective tissue of those relationships. And naturally, not all of these are like perfect solving the challenge or issue type of magic wand applicators. And again, this is where having your internal governance systems and commitments in place comes very important, because there's a lot of room for interpretation in the application of these. For instance, we all know IBAs are not necessarily, again, the magic wand solution, and depending on their development and the level of participation with Indigenous communities on that, the level of accountability triggers also involved in those, they can be more representative than effective. And so making sure that we understand what best practices look like in constructing these, and of course the level of participation with the communities affected is top of mind there. And then depending on where you're situated provincially, there are specific policies like in British Columbia and Ontario, and of course the Mining Association of Canada has built towards sustainable mining program and kind of framework as well. So it's kind of a double-edged sword where there is a lot of regulatory, I would say noise, for lack of a better word, but at the same time guidance in terms of what good looks like and how your organization can kind of adopt a programmatic framework that addresses the full suite of your value chain piece, including the procurement pieces. So I've included both ones that are applied holistically to the organization, that start when you're prospecting, all the way through operation and decommissioning as well. And again, a lot of factors pushing us to take a stock of the level of participation in our own programming that we have around pulling Indigenous voices into this process. And obviously beyond those that are being pushed from a regulatory perspective, there's a lot of public scrutiny and brand and reputational value on the line as we think about these components. I've pulled out two recent examples here, and again, not to tut anyone on specifically as a company, and if you have representatives from these companies on the phone, again, not being hypercritical, but more so utilizing these as examples of how even when you're meeting existing standards, when you take on your additional kind of, your initial kind of agreements and understandings with Indigenous communities, as the regulatory environment has developed and as more activation has happened at the grassroots level globally for Indigenous communities, as climate change effects hit them more significantly and first, retroactively there are repercussions happening and pushback happening from those that may not have navigated the conversation with Indigenous communities from start as thoroughly as they could have. And so an example of this was we're looking at First Quantum Minerals, specifically in Panama, really recently. This is probably one of the most aggressive components of pushback that we've seen, but there was a very large groundswelling of Panama community groups, especially those representing the Indigenous communities, that came to kind of scrutinize and push back on some of the mining activities that were occurring on those sites. And this was kind of a surprise for a lot of folks, as there's been a significant amount of regulatory back and forth and legislation already around this, around sovereignty and how mining companies interact with land agreements in this space. So this is one that kind of has come across our attention a little bit more from a regulatory perspective, and a lot of our mining partners as well, just to make sure that we are taking stock of the existing process and ensuring it now meets best practice compliance. We think about the length and the lifespan of a mine. What was technically regulatory compliant 10 years ago may not still be the case. And while you may legally have checked the correct boxes, there is a significant amount of groundswell movement from Indigenous communities starting to recalibrate and re-examine agreements to ensure that they are best practice and pushing forward. So the reason, of course, this being important is, this is an extreme example where the mine was completely closed and caused a significant amount of financial challenges for the company specifically. But even in examples where mines artificially closed, disruption in service and access, any type of public scrutiny or injunctions throw off projections, of course, and have financial impact. And so we've also seen that in the second example as well. I put in there on Noront Resources and the financial impact that has had. So whether you're looking at this from a compliance standpoint or a risk management standpoint, obviously a lot of movement in this space and a lot of attention, something we expect to only grow as global community concerns around environmental components and around social practices rise. So as I mentioned, there's the extent of the value chain. I mean, obviously this is hyper simplified, but just for illustration purposes here, we kind of started to speak to ways to involve Indigenous communities or considerations around the kind of prospecting and exploration phase. What we'll sink more into today is kind of that middle component around when we're getting into the project development and the actual mining operations component as we think about procurement. But just wanted to illustrate as well that there's kind of a broad variety of intersection moments for these pieces. And unfortunately it got cut off here, but in the presentation we'll send around after, I have a list of both frameworks and organizations at each one of these stages that you could reference as a way to make sure that your organization is kind of maximizing your connective opportunities here and meeting best practices. This includes frameworks and certification bodies. And we'll talk a little bit more about certifications later as well. And then last but not least, under this kind of external driver and relevance piece in terms of like why we're being pushed in this direction. And why specifically procurement, health and safety as well, and kind of supply chain risk management plays such a crucial role is depending on the industry that you fall into, up to 90% of the metrics you're reporting upon to GRI or to CDP or to ICMM or other groups is related to your supply chain. And I believe mining, while not specifically called out here, falls in that third kind of piece under construction and materials, insurance, goods. So you're looking at like 70 to 72% being directly related to your supply chain versus the direct impact, of course, of your operations themselves. And so having both transparency into your supply chain performance in this space and also some type of relationship management or continuous improvement connection is really critical across the whole breadth of sustainability issues. But obviously, when we're speaking specifically to Indigenous connectivity, really critical as well. So now that we've kind of a general understanding of the complexities of this space and the internal and external drivers, let's talk through a couple of like specific examples of organizations applying these strategies that are identified in various frameworks like TSM to make sure that they're maximizing opportunities for Indigenous participation into their supply chain. So we'll go through a couple of examples and then I'll talk as well a bit about like the governance piece. And we try to leave about 10 to 15 minutes for questions as well. So I'll try not to speed through these, but also want to make sure we leave some ample padding for conversation. So as we're going through and chatting through these examples, please feel free to drop questions in the Q&A box. I can pick them up as we roll along, or we can address them after as well. All right, so as we're thinking about examples, I started kind of upside down with governance. We'll talk through the procurement pieces in the next slide. But again, I really feel like governance is the least explored aspect of these, but one of the most critical when we think about kind of the sandwich of our programming. And I kind of referred to that here as upstream and downstream. So I'll talk about the specifics there. But I pulled out an example, obviously not specifically in the mining community, but one that has significant stake in land in the in operations in Canada. So this is a major electric provider, specifically in Ontario, that has a really active program with Indigenous community leaders and the communities themselves from the beginning of their services, as well as to who they consider their stakeholders and reporting stakeholders, which is interesting, and we'll talk through in a second. But the biggest piece that they started with, and I'm going a little upside down from my bullets here, but having an Indigenous relations policy. And again, a lot of folks here I know are pretty in advanced organizations. This is probably something you did, decades ago. But two components there. One, making sure it's been refreshed and has been reviewed within the last 3 years. We typically recommend at least every 2 to 3 years that these policies undergo revision and review, just because, again, of how quickly things are moving, both regulatorily and best practice-wise. And also that you ensure it has some type of accountability and compliance teeth as well, in terms of, who watches the watchman, like who is responsible for the execution of these pieces, what does good look like, and how do we hold ourselves accountable to them. So starting with that aspect of governance, and as you think about the people and conversations that need to occur to be able to develop that and continuously review that, you'll start to see that organically you're building out these stakeholders in your organization and likely identifying kind of the governance committee that you'd want to see applied to this part of your work stream. So having the relations policy to start, absolutely critical. And it helps us do some of that internal housekeeping to make sure that we have alignment, transparency, and understanding around these principles and needs for the group. Then within that is usually the activation piece that includes a procurement program and goal. And so as you look at the kind of saturation of the Indigenous community in the places that you work, their level of representation in whether it's small businesses or otherwise, and the variety of classifications of those vendors, you could start to build a tapestry and a database of sorts to understand the availability of different Indigenous businesses to meet the different classification of business and suppliers that you need to have. And so this is something that can be kind of layered onto an existing procurement process and program. We work with an international facilities management company that has a 20% commitment to diverse suppliers. And so that includes everything from veteran and women-owned to Indigenous and beyond. And what they've started to utilize is through partnering with Avetta, they've started to get transparency into their suppliers, both understanding who identifies as these different classifications and has the certifications to prove that they meet the thresholds for defining a business as women-owned, et cetera. And then ensuring that they are operating from, whether it's a health and safety perspective or a sustainability perspective, at par or beyond the organization expectations. And knowing that they have a pool of candidates and suppliers that may not currently satisfy those business requirements, whether it's from a programmatic perspective or a cost perspective, but pulling them into their kind of visible supply chain groups so that they continue to work with us and work directly with this organization to improve their compliance over time and improve and expand the pool of available diverse suppliers that they are able to select from as business progresses. Something that was also interesting as we think about hydro is they've actually worked to think about the kind of future of the industry. So, being in utilities provision and thinking about the energy transition and how we need to think about, fuel mixes in the future, they've actually partnered directly with Indigenous communities as part of their kind of business strategic approach to have them bring innovative solutions to them based on their own historical knowledge and perspective. And so not only are they part of the business directly from a procurement process, but they're also part of building business strategy as they think about expansion, as they think about increasing demand, as they think about the energy transition, and being able to bring in that specific wisdom and insight and proactively integrate it into any future planning so that instead of kind of trying to force a square peg into a round hole and we're already, 10 years into a project, we're able to kind of take this thoughtful design into account before starting new projects, whether that's in existing geographies or new ones as well. And then the last component here that I think is really interesting from a governance perspective is they've specifically created programming that is about listening only, essentially, from a community perspective, to kind of the traditional knowledge that is held within Indigenous communities about the geographies that they occupy. So this has helped them not only restructure how they do environmental assessments and the considerations they take into account before beginning a project, but also has helped them better identify projects that are less risky. So as we think about, how kind of prospecting and that process of attrition goes about currently, this group has actually been able to identify land expansions that suit the needs of the business that bring in significantly less ecological risk and challenges for them by incorporating additional lenses of their ecological assessments and impacts. We have what is regulatorily required. They've added in this extra layer based on the knowledge of the communities that they partner with. And it's helped them save time and cost when they're doing prospecting for these pieces. The last thing to call attention to, and again, maybe common knowledge for a lot of you folks on the phone, but thinking about partnerships and regulatory partnerships specifically with organizations like the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business and others. Some that may be specific to the province that you're in, and some that may be specific to the industry or the ore that you're utilizing and primarily as part of your portfolio. But there are a lot of these groups that have been brought up from a regional and global perspective, and referenced ICMM and others, that can help not only provide guidance. So in going through this process with them of assessment, you're getting insight into the framework of, what aspects of the business do you need to have this type of connective tissue with, what does good look like? But then you're also getting this ability for external recognition and validation from trusted groups. And again, there's a lot of variety into the level of legitimacy and trust with these organizations. So doing a bit of homework in terms of ones that have kind of the respect of the industry. And this is again where conversations with Indigenous communities in terms of how they would assess an organization's performance in this space, or brands that they recognize or groups that they trust. This being one of the more highly rated ones. But this gives you kind of external validation as well. So whether you're in existing project geographies or you're prospecting into new ones, being able to kind of bring this type of external signaling that you're an organization that has the internal infrastructure, has gone through the governance, has projects that have taken these components into account and are essentially operating with best practice principles for involving Indigenous communities, can really go a long way to de-escalating or accelerating the community process that you go through for new sites, continued sites, et cetera. And this is something that we're starting to see more and more as organizations go through this exercise, help formalize internal processes, and then are able to utilize this from a marketing perspective, but also when they're starting new conversations with new communities. So flipping it from governance then into kind of the procurement and trading aspect. So we talked a little bit, like process, documentation, governance bodies are really important. But now we're talking about kind of plugging into that overall system and activating those groups. So two quick examples here. Obviously, Rio Tinto being a well-known name in the mining space. Specifically with their diamond mine in the Northwest Territories, they had a pilot program that was launched essentially and has since expanded that encompasses a lot of the best practices for integrating and participating in Indigenous communities. So the first one, obviously, we know procurement is quite critical in this space. They actually put some pretty significant commitments down after going through year one, where they assessed what is the available supplier pool. We got some transparency into representation amongst our suppliers, and also put them through an ESG analysis to understand how they were performing themselves environmentally, socially, and from a governance perspective. From there, we're able to build baselines that are founded in actual data. and that makes sense and reflect both our commitments as an organization and how we'd like to push and benefit Indigenous communities, and also the availability of the existing workforce and representation within that certain geography. And so by helping prioritize Indigenous suppliers, they've actually driven over 2.5 billion CAD toward Indigenous businesses, and our represented workforce is almost 30% Indigenous. And so thinking about that in two ways, like individually contributing to the economic benefits of the community, and also contributing to the overall business community within the Indigenous community, having those ripple effects. And obviously, this is something that takes a bit of a review of existing processes. As we think about 30% representation in that workforce is pretty significant, even for the saturation and representation of Indigenous communities in that space. So a lot of investment in the kind of marketing, communication, and availability of these roles, everything down to how we put out job descriptions, the words that we choose, how we stack things under qualifications or minimum qualifications, can actually have an impact on the types of people that respond. And so to kind of put this into specific examples, there's a lot of data now that shows between female and male applicants will apply for a job if they meet like 2 out of 10 requirements. Females will only apply if they meet 8 or more of the requirements. And for a lot of jobs, some of those may not be negotiable. There are things that require certain certifications and standards, but some of those other pieces that like we put into job requirements are ones that are more flexible or trainable, et cetera. And so just by the way that we are organizing our job descriptions and the verbiage that we're choosing, we can be having people self-select themselves out of our employment process. So that's true as well for different cultural communities as well. So this is something that organizations will hire outside third-party support to quickly review not only their like job descriptions, but also their hiring processes and policies to ensure that there isn't anything that's kind of forcing bias unknown to us and helping people self-select out. And that includes disbursement channels. So where are we advertising these roles? Are we offering any type of extended training programs for folks that may be, X amount shy for this certification, or with a 6-week immersive program could then qualify for these roles? And are we building those bridges necessary? One, to make sure that we have enough available human capital to begin with, but also to try to maximize, again, the representation from Indigenous communities, recognizing that there are opportunity gaps and when and where can we close them for a way that has circular benefit. In this type of training, both before work begins and during the work, is a big component of IBAs and other pieces that drive value into the community and can be offered as benefits for allowing mining in that space, et cetera. As we think about the Musselwhite mine, this is one that had a lot of complexity because not atypical, I'm sure, for a lot of folks working not only in the Canadian market, but beyond. There's typically more than one Indigenous stakeholder when it comes to the land packages that we're exploring. And each one of those communities is unique, driven by different values. There's obviously coalitions, but being able to understand the cultural differentiations and norms and value drivers for the differing represented bodies is obviously really critical, requires a lot of boots on the ground participation and hiring as well. Another way that you can help advance business drivers and also contribute to the community is hiring from within the Indigenous communities to help build that initial bridge of conversation. But in addition to procurement practices, I didn't want to repeat it here, but of course they have a commitment to Indigenous business from a procurement perspective. They've also looked at opportunities to award contracts outside of like basic operations. So of course there are different classifications of suppliers we need to have, from transporting and hauling or smelting or whatever direct line of the mining value chain we own. But then there are also pieces around if you have any business real estate in the organization or host events, and things need to have land management or event management and things of that nature, making sure that we're just maximizing Indigenous representation wherever contracts become available for us from a procurement perspective. And again, IBAs here playing a really big role. As I mentioned, I think the efficacy of them is really dependent on the organization's commitment to structuring them in a way that holds accountability. But this is, again, where having that representation and connection with Indigenous communities and that conversation goes a long way. And sometimes just that exercise alone can help significantly in meeting down any type of resistant current or future. And I think I'm harping on that specifically because, as I said, these are not necessarily new tools, but what has been happening is after decades of having some type of IBA, either directly or that structure with Indigenous communities, what's happened is Indigenous communities have found that those commitments or promises did not yield the economic value that was presented by the company originally. And in fact, during the decommissioning process or whatnot, sometimes leaves the community in a state where they still have a water boil mandate or are dealing with excluded infrastructure that was left behind, or the road that was put through the community in order to connect the mine to the main drag, etc. So this is where some of these kind of retroactive challenges are coming, even for folks that have existing understandings with Indigenous communities, because folks are wanting to have a bit more of accountability, transparency, and leverage in these conversations. So I'll take just another couple minutes and then we'll turn it over to questions. But we spoke a little bit about the governance piece. And again, I want to kind of put some icing on the cake here then in terms of best practices and steps that your organization should have when you're thinking about ensuring that you have a best-in-class Indigenous community kind of practice across the business. So the first piece, of course, we said table stakes, develop that relations policy and go through the internal mechanisms required to do so. If you already have one and it hasn't been revisited or revised in the last 2 to 3 years, starting kind of a small exercise just to ensure not only compliance and risk management, but again, best practice. How far can we drive this? How are we learning from peer groups that have similar policies or whatnot and have experienced backlash or challenges that were not initially encompassed or identified by the policy? And again, this is something that's better when it has teeth. So it has kind of defined measurable goals and what those look like, and hopefully that they're integrated to some level of C-suite or board involvement as well, because that type of exposure, of course, makes sure that we are getting the investments that we need to drive this programmatic achievement. And also including that it has the kind of overall governance and oversight. Depending on the size of your operations, you may have a representative on a broader stakeholder board rather than a specific board or group dedicated to Indigenous community programming and activities, or it may be spread across the different kind of verticals within the organization, from procurement to health and safety to community relations to ESG. But making sure that you have some type of communication channel and uniting force there to ensure alignment, especially as we anticipate significant legislation dropping across North America in the next couple of years, again, with additional emphasis on biodiversity, deforestation, and Indigenous communities, all major things that impact the mining industry and prospecting opportunities. This again, obviously coming from the United States, something that I really like to see is the FPIC approach. I'm so jealous to see how it's kind of integrated more deeply into kind of Canadian business development, and hopefully something we can absorb as well. But I think ensuring as well that you are checking all the boxes, so to speak, when it comes to FPIC and community liaison and involvement with Indigenous communities is critical. This is where, again, some of the backlash or even the example we gave in Panama with the mine closing, actually what tripped them up, which was the idea of fully informed consent. So they were able to build a case where there was not enough transparency from the mining company across different aspects of social and economic impacts to the community that had been well documented. So again, this is where having data and commitments is really important, and also that transparency with the Indigenous communities that you're working with is important to make sure that there's fair and transparent negotiations occurring, and ones that can stand the test of time during the duration and lifespan of your mine. I talked a lot about governance, so I won't go so much deeper into that, but specifically then the activation channel around creating procurement opportunities that specifically meet the kind of pool needs of the Indigenous communities that you occupy. So again, we're not talking about a lessening or a lowering of any kind of standards and requirements, but rather an investigation of existing processes to ensure that they are fully addressing the opportunity gaps that we know exist in the Indigenous communities we occupy. We spoke a little bit about how some of that can come through from even how we craft our job descriptions to where we advertise those positions, et cetera. Similar process review opportunities within our procurement process. Things that can sometimes be pieces of friction to Indigenous communities accessing your available business and work that aren't linked to their ability to fulfill or meet costs, but are simply rather just like process frictions, as we chatted about. And so again, there's third parties that could help support with this, but there's also a lot of best practices in the TSM and others that speak to how you can start to integrate Indigenous communities more into your procurement process. Some of that may be recognizing that because of the nature and size of the groups at this current time, they would not be able to make it through your procurement process, but you've identified 50, 100, 1,000 or more groups that you can then start building connections with, pull into whatever, SAP Ariba or whatever you're utilizing, and work with on a continuous improvement plan with as well. A lot of the work that I do is working with suppliers that companies want to partner with, whether they identify from a minority group or as veterans or not, but they're just not up to standard yet. And the company has identified them as opportunity spaces because they have commitments to a certain group, or because they're local and would reduce transportation and distribution costs significantly. And how can we get them up to our compliance standards over time? So thinking about investments you can make in that space, even if there aren't a lot of opportunity fits currently, how can you grow that population and bring them more deeply into your procurement process? When we think back to the hydro example, they actually host a database of suppliers that meet certain criteria, especially those from Indigenous communities, that can be accessed directly from their website, and are inviting others to add themselves to that directory as well through their website. And so they're not only gathering an additional cache of potential suppliers that they could vet down the line, but they're helping showcase those suppliers to others and hopefully driving business their way too. So there's a lot of ways you could be creative about this. I put how, from a federal perspective, the government approaches this. Obviously, they have commitments as well to Indigenous participation in the procurement and value chains. So as you start to think about opportunities that maybe not be directly linked to your offerings currently, there's a couple strategies here around the wheel that I found have worked well in kind of the near term, short term, and long term, and building up your cache of available suppliers in this space. So apologies, per usual, I get a little on my soapbox, so to speak, in this space, but we still have about 7-8 minutes left for questions. So I'll turn it back over to the CIM team to see if any came through the chat, or if people want to raise any currently in the Q&A box. So, thank you.
Great, thanks, Katie. That was really interesting, and your point about how job descriptions can and how you phrase them can be a really impact who applies, I think is an important message. So yes, we do have a question from Hannah, and I believe, if I understand it correctly, I think she's so let me just put it to you, and maybe if you follow the direction, then by all means go with it. When it comes to ESG, is there consideration for non-IBA holding Indigenous employees, which I understand probably is maybe they are identified as Indigenous, but maybe aren't captured by the IBA that is with the operating company? And if they don't have status but want to access gainful employment through the mine, is there consideration of those people when presenting any ESG standards and I guess Indigenous employment numbers, et cetera?
Yeah, and I think this question hits at like such a complex issue, and one that's, I think, really representative of how amazingly unique we are as just like a global people. But how when you're trying to run, a business environment that's fair and equitable, it can, you know, it take a bit more consideration to ensure, appropriate application. So the short answer to your question is yes. They traditionally don't come through IBAs. That's as far as I'm aware, a term that's specifically reserved in this context, but there are vehicles that are similar to IBAs that companies take on in terms of allowing access and showcasing their commitment to embracing diversity within their own existing direct employee groups and their supplier groups. So when you think in the broader like DEI principles, and I know that's it's so interesting. There's the distinct historical context between America and Canada as well that drive how these things get applied. So what I would suggest doing is looking at both from a national and a provincial level, what DEI advocacy groups and best practices groups are available, because they have both IBA-like frameworks that you could utilize, and also how you pull that into your organization overall, even down to like the specific examples of job descriptions that we covered. But typically, IBAs are reserved specifically for the involved and recognized Indigenous communities and the mining organization directly, because it is about the specific transaction for this geographic location rather than the broader organization.
Thank you. So maybe, can you provide an example of a successful relationship between a mining proponent and Indigenous community in relation to procurement? Like what was the service or good being procured, and how did you measure the outcome?
Yeah, I think I would flip back specifically. This is a bit more of a publicly facing one that I felt comfortable sharing because they've actually published on this specifically. So that's where when we were speaking about Rio Tinto, and this is available in their procurement reporting and their sustainability reporting as well, their Indigenous procurement policy commitments, their goals, and their annual spend, and how that's been increasing over year. So when it comes to specific classifications of work that they have showcased, that would be available in their report, but it definitely oscillates based on the year-to-year needs programmatically. A lot of that is typically in transportation and also in services that have to do with electric maintenance and with like plumbing and pipe maintenance. And forgive me for not having the specific terminology top of mind there. But essentially utilizing the existing workforce to attend to some of the operational aspects, even if they're not specifically employed by the mine in working heavy equipment or part of the extraction process.
Okay. So we have another question about how does GBA plus implementation, specifically culturally relevant GBA plus, play into sustainable procurement? Is this a consideration for industry?
Yeah, I mean, forgive me, I kind of mashed a little bit of the process together rather than keeping it as separate as it needed to be. So I think that was more so just to illustrate that even before we get to the procurement process, there's a lot of operational aspects that occur that offer opportunities for Indigenous participation, investment, et cetera. And that can either create or limit your opportunities later down the value chain when we're talking about procurement specifically and operational components. So I'd say that it's not a direct one-to-one like linear connection, but the decisions and how the project and program are designed initially have ramifications down the road for opportunities. And oftentimes Indigenous communities can tell you about how that your initial decisions will create friction or create opportunity when you involve them earlier in the process. And so that's why I've been typically pushing more exposure down the line, and also for procurement to have a greater voice earlier in the process, as much as their role allows, since it will eventually create kind of golden handcuffs for you down the way too.
Okay, fascinating stuff. Lots to talk about. not sure we'll be able to pack any more into our allotted time, but Katie, your details will be shared with all attendees. So if they have follow-up questions, they can reach out to you. And of course, this presentation can be, and like you said, you'll be sharing slides, and this presentation can be consulted after the fact. Thank you very much, Katie.
Yeah, pleasure to be here. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Katie. And thanks to all of our attendees. We hope you enjoyed the webinar. Please fill out the short survey that pops up on your screen at the close of the webinar. A link to the video recording of this webinar will be emailed to you tomorrow. For more online presentations like this one, visit the CIM calendar of events on cim.org. We look forward to seeing you at our next Solutions Exchange webinar. Thank you very much and have a good afternoon. Bye.
Thank you.